Alright guys, welcome to another video. This is a common problems about the C4 Corvette. So I will be making a list of common problems. This is not a list of all the problems. Your car may have some of these problems, your car may have different problems, your car may have none of these problems. This is simply a list of common problems with the C4 Corvette. This being an L98 has a pretty traditional distributor at the back. But the LT1 cars from 92 to 96 use an OptiSpark distributor setup, and it's found on the front of the engine underneath the water pump, and it uses an optical sensor to determine when to fire the spark plugs. This sounds like a very high-tech thing, and it's very cool, and when it works well, it works nice. So that's great, except remember when I mentioned it's under the water pump, and what do water pumps do eventually? They leak. And an optical sensor, it's functioned by sight. So when that gets all nice and rusted up from the coolant leaking on it from the water pump, you are left with a car that no longer runs. This sucks majorly. However, it's very well documented, and there's been plenty of different kits available to convert the LT1 cars with OptiSpark to a later model 0411 ECM setup to use coil-on plug ignitions very similar to an LS and become much more reliable and much more tunable. So there's plenty of kits out there to convert LT1s to later coil-on plug ignition setups. And there's also plenty of OptiSpark replacement parts available, so you can replace the OptiSpark with another OptiSpark. So that's cool too if you wanted to keep your car all original or you didn't want to go through the hassle of converting it to a coil-on plug ignition. But just know that the OptiSpark will and always will be prone to failure and potentially leaving you stranded. People have reported various misfire issues and things of the sort. I had a 95 Trans Am with an LT1. I didn't have any OptiSpark issues, but I only had the car for a few years, so my window of experience with the LT1 is relatively limited. But yeah, OptiSpark, very common problem on the LT1 and LT4 cars. The later 96 LT4 cars, I believe 95 LT1s as well, got a vented OptiSpark, which basically had a little opening in the bottom of the OptiSpark that let the coolant that dripped onto it drain out, so it cut down on the corrosion that was found inside of the OptiSpark. So the vented OptiSpark is a superior setup to the non-vented OptiSpark found on the earlier LT1s. But the OptiSpark in general is a flawed design. Very common problem. Another common problem, this is more so related to the L98 cars like this one, is intake gasket leaks. For whatever reason, they're super common on these cars. Mine leaks a lot, and it's very annoying. So definitely something you want to keep an eye on. Mine's leaked since I bought it. I just make sure to check the oil level, but it is really annoying, so I'm going to have to tear mine apart and redo all my intake gaskets at some point. That leads me to my next point, is fuel injectors. A common problem, not that they fail, but since these cars are so old now, it's pretty common to have replaced the fuel injectors at least once throughout the life of the car. However, tuned port engines are kind of picky with fuel injectors, and a lot of the fuel injectors available as replacements for the tuned port are kind of cheap crap. And these tuned ports, if you put these cheap crappy injectors in them, they don't like to run very well. So if you're going to replace the fuel injectors, make sure you get high quality ones, do your research, read reviews, make sure you're getting high quality fuel injectors if you're going to replace them on your L98. Another common problem on the C4, and this is really any car with a 700R4 transmission, is TV cable adjustments. There is a cable that runs to the throttle, that runs down to the transmission, and it controls many aspects of the transmission. The 700R4 is not computer controlled. It is controlled by, different inputs from this TV cable. And when this TV cable is not adjusted properly, it can make the transmission shift really bad. It can make the transmission not shift at all. And it can make the transmission fail if you're not careful. So make sure you know what you're doing and do your research when you're adjusting the TV cable or removing the TV cable or replacing the TV cable. Whatever it is, if you're touching the TV cable, do your research, because you can really screw up the 700R4 if you're not careful. Common failure on the C4 This is mostly relevant to 92 and 93 LT1 cars. As you can see, my car here, we just have the cruise control apparatus. The 92 to 93 LT1 cars will have a big ECM mounted here, big silver looking computer thingamajig. And while they're not super problematic, when they do fail, which a handful of ECMs will fail, that's just how that goes, they can be extraordinarily expensive to replace. There is a company, I believe in New York, I believe it was Flagship One. I've used them for different ECMs in the past, but I believe they are one of the few that can reprogram a 92 to 93 LT1 ECM. But definitely do your research on that. But the ECMs on the 92 to 93s, very, very expensive, very hard to replace, very hard to find. So definitely something you want to be careful with if you have a 92 to 93 LT1 C4. Another common problem on the C4 is various brake booster related problems and master cylinder related problems. People have had these fail. You know, brake boosters fail. It's just like any other car part, and these cars are quite old. The only problem is it can be difficult to find a replacement brake booster, and if you notice, that one is plastic. That's the original brake booster, and they are prone to failure. The master cylinder can be failing as well. These parts can be very hard to find, quality parts I should say, because very commonly the replacement brake boosters and replacement master cylinders are bad right out of the box. Seems to be more of a problem on these cars than it is on other cars, and it's really a shame because it's extreme. The brake booster is a really big job to do. You have to get way under the brake pedal, way up in there, to actually perform that swap. So if you do all that work to find out that your parts are bad out of the box, that really sucks, and I've heard of a lot of people being screwed that way. The next common problem, not relevant to my car because it's an automatic, but the Doug Nash 4+3 manual transmission. Those are a 4-speed. It's basically a Muncie T10 that has an electronic automatic operated with a button automatic transmission on the back of it, hence the +3. So you have 4 gears manually selected from the T10, and then if you hit the button on top of the shifter, it's very similar to the button on top of this automatic shifter, it will engage the overdrive transmission, giving you a nice overdrive gear for cruising at high speeds. In theory, very nice to have those overdrive options. However, in practice, it was very unreliable, and these days, parts are insanely expensive and hard to find to repair it. So if you do have a Doug Nash 4+3 and it works, consider yourself lucky, but, you know, count your days, because they will generally fail eventually with enough use, and they're not great with dealing with huge amounts of power either. So if you have a 4+3, be careful. And definitely you want to keep up on the service, changing the fluids and things like that, because if that 4+3 unit fails, they're expensive to find, they're hard to find, and parts can be very difficult. Another common problem, again, for the manual C4s is the later model 89 to 96 ZF6. When it was new, it was a very good transmission, and in perfect condition they shift very nicely and they can hold a nice amount of power. The common problem with them is, on a manual car, generally, they have to go through at least 1 or 2 clutch changes throughout the life of the vehicle. The problem being is you can no longer find the correct dual mass flywheel for the ZF6 on the C4. This becomes a problem because the original dual mass flywheel cannot always be remachined to use with a new clutch. So you might end up using a single mass flywheel, which is currently the only one available new. And what that's going to do is that's going to cause a nice chatter at idle from your clutch. And I've heard these in person. It is kind of irritating. It's irritating to the point that I think if I had a ZF6, I would really look into doing a different transmission if I had to replace the clutch, because that chatter would get really annoying. That, or you just have to make the exhaust so loud that you don't hear the chatter anymore. But a very common thing when replacing the clutch on a ZF6 is if you lose that dual mass flywheel because your original one wasn't able to be used, you will end up with a nice clutch chatter that is generally very irritating. Another common problem on the C4 is the differentials. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with the differential of the C4. However, it's a sports car. They have powerful engines, and they have relatively powerful engines. The engines can be made significantly more powerful. The differentials, however, on the automatic cars are significantly weaker than the manual cars. The automatic cars have a Dana 36 differential, and the manual cars have a Dana 44. This is something that you want to consider if you're going to be drag racing the car or overall abusing the car. The automatic cars will have a weaker differential, so if you're going to race or abuse an automatic car, definitely want to think about stepping it up to a Dana 44 differential from a manual car. These are quite expensive to find. You know, C4s, they made a lot of them, but they're 40 years old. They're not the most common vehicles. And to find the Dana 44 axle, which was the rarer axle to begin with, is not the easiest thing in the world, and certainly not the cheapest. So differential problems, pretty common when you start really beating on the automatic Dana 36 C4s. Another common problem, I'm not going to crawl under the car in the high school parking lot here, there is a lot of U-joints on this C4. You have a drive shaft, which is relatively short, which runs from the tail shaft of the transmission to the differential. That has U-joints. But then your axle shafts are not the common CV axles that we know today. These have U-joints on each of the half shafts. So these can cause all different kinds of noises and clunks and grinding and humming and vibrations. So if you're having these weird problems, maybe it's not a bad idea to do all the U-joints on your C4, or ones that look bad, or whatever. Use your best judgment. Point being, the U-joints, since there's so many of them on the C4, is definitely something you want to look at for any kind of weird vibrations or grinding or humming or whatever. U-joints, common problem. Next up on our list is VATs. Now I will pull the key out of my pocket, and as you can see here, the rectangular key is the ignition key, and you see it has that little chip on the metal part. That is a resistor that when you slide it into the ignition is supposed to, the computer is supposed to read that resistance and recognize that key as the key to this car. That means that only this key can start this car. Well, there's actually like 15 different resistance values that GM used. However, this system is very reliable. These resistors can fail, they can get worn out, the contacts can get dirty, the ignition switch can fail, it can get worn out, the contacts can get dirty. All around a very unreliable system for anti-theft. And it's not even that effective. VATS historically has been much more effective at keeping the owner of the car from driving the car than it has been from keeping thieves from driving the car. VATS, very common problem. There's plenty of write-ups online and videos on how to delete it, to bypass it, various ways to do so. Definitely something you want to look into. You can do that even with a PROM reprogramming. Something you might want to look into if you have a car with VATs. And it's not just the Corvette, it's pretty much any GM car from this time period. Camaros, Firebirds, anything like that. Another common problem, which I unfortunately have real-world experience with, is on the C4, it is very common, both early and late models, for the tilt pins in the steering column to be worn out. Now, it's not only the tilt pins, various bearings and bushings inside the steering column are also very prone to wear on these cars. Extremely common problem. What this stems from is, since the car is relatively hard to get in and out of, people, mainly older gentlemen, potentially heavier gentlemen, will use the steering wheel as a handle to push themselves out of the car. So they put a lot of weight on the steering wheel, pushing it down. And what this does is it wears those tilt pins and all the bushings in the column out, and you're left with a column that will wobble if you grab it and shake it up and down. My car did this pretty bad when I first bought it. I replaced the tilt pin with an unbalanced engineering oversized tilt pin. Not too hard of a job, but you did have to extract the original and then hammer the oversized one in. It did require some disassembly here. But yeah, wobbly steering columns, very common on the C4. Very annoying as well, and can be very costly and time-consuming to replace. Next up is the digital dash. All right, so now you see on this car, this is an 89. 84 to 89 had the fully digital dash. Very cool. Everybody loves it. Historically not the most reliable piece. There is companies out there that can rebuild it. BATE, B-A-T-E-E, has been known to do a very nice job refreshing this gauge cluster. They are who did mine in 2008. They did a very nice job because here we are, what, 18 years, 17 years later, still works very nice. So you might think that if you get a later model, 90 to 96 C4 with the updated interior, that you're safe. That is not the case. However, those gauge clusters can also be repaired by BATE, so that is something you might want to keep in mind. Digital dash and the later dash with the digital portion, both of those are prone to failure over time. Another common problem, this is basic, just old plastic car issue. The plastics rattle, the plastics break, the plastics creak, they squeak, they moan, they shatter. It's not a specifically Corvette problem, but the C4, since it has so much plastic in it, you're going to run into these squeaks, creaks, rattles, cracking plastic, especially with temperature changes and things like that. So if you want a high quality interior, modern amenities and stuff, the C4 is not for you. Very common for these interiors to have faded plastics and broken plastics and make all kinds of different sounds. And if you take the target top off, the car creaks a lot more than it does with the target top in. Definitely a common problem. It doesn't mean anything about the car is broken. It's just kind of the nature of the beast. Still love the car. I wouldn't dissuade somebody from buying one because of that. But if the crappy interior is something that's going to bother you, probably not the car for you. Another common problem is this here headlight switch. The headlight switch is a very similar headlight switch that's found in hundreds of thousands of other GM cars of the time period. What I'm referring to mostly is this plastic that it is mounted to. This is a very common problem on these early C4 cars. The later C4s had a knob that you turn that's, you know, sounding real nice right about now. But this plastic here is mounted. This is the dashboard substrate panel. The switch sits in there, and when you push and pull it out, it applies force in and out on this cheap, brittle plastic that is now 40 years old, and it causes it to crack. Mine worked fine until I was removing the dash bezel for some other maintenance, and that led to the dashboard substrate shattering. There is some kits on the forums. A guy makes a nice metal plate for about $10 to mount the switch to, and it reinforces all this, so you can glue the metal plate on there to reinforce this corner. You could also replace the whole dashboard substrate, but that's a huge amount of work and a huge amount of money. So I would recommend just putting the metal plate there, which is what I plan to do. Another common failure point on the C4 is this little fella right here. This is the HVAC controller. Now my car, you know, all fancy and high option, has the electronic HVAC controller, which sucks majorly. These are known to fail. These are known to not do what you want. Mine currently has a few dead buttons that change. Sometimes the cool button works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the digital readout works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it freaks out. Sometimes all the buttons actuate themselves. All around, crappy controller. Very, very common though, and there is a guy on eBay who will actually repair your HVAC controller for about $100. So I will have mine done this year because I'm tired of it being a piece of crap. Very common problem. All right, next problem. This car, being an 89, does not have a key fob. However, it was optional, I believe, starting in 89, and then the 94 to 96 cars had different key fobs with the passive entry system similar to the C5, which was garbage. The key fobs, not the C5. The C5 is fantastic, but the passive entry system really sucks. The 94 to 96 Corvettes, being a specific key fob, those can be extraordinarily expensive to replace. If your 94 to 96 Corvette key fob dies or breaks or whatever, I've heard of people, whether or not this is entirely true or not, I've heard of people spending upwards of $1,000 on a key fob for a 94 to 96 Corvette, which is just obscene in my opinion. If my car did that, I'd just be manually opening the door with the little lock using the manual key, because that is insane in my opinion. But yeah, key fobs for C4 Corvettes, can be relatively unreliable, and they can be extraordinarily expensive. Another thing to think about, common problems. This car has a 91 to 96 rear clip. This is not stock. The original rear clip on this 89 would have had these smaller circular taillights, which I think look cooler, but the previous owner did this. Don't worry about it. As you can see here, we have little screws that when you remove them, you can pop the whole taillight out, put the new bulb in. Very nice, very convenient. The 84 to 89 cars do not have that luxury. You will have to remove the license plate and reach your arm way up in there behind there to remove the bulbs and replace them, or go up from the bottom of the car and do it that way. Definitely a pain in the butt and a very common thing, because you know, most cars with incandescent taillights, you'll have to replace them at least a couple times throughout the life of the car. And on the 84 to 89 C4s, it's kind of a pain in the neck. Another common problem is the turn signal socket melting. So this car, much like Firebirds and Corvettes and things like that, C5s, they use the turn signal as a daytime running light. So anytime your car is in drive or the parking breaks down on a manual, these lights will illuminate as daytime running lights, which is fine. They look cool, fantastic. Except it's an incandescent bulb, and when you run it constantly like that with relatively high current, they burn the socket out and it melts. So then you have to replace the socket. I've had this problem on many Firebirds. I've had this problem on this car. I've had this problem on my C5. Replace the bulbs with LEDs and put an electronic capable turn signal flasher. You will not have to do that job ever again. Take it from me. Another common problem is just AC motor and blend door issues. I'm not going to show them to you because that would require the entire dashboard removal, which I'm not going to do, sorry. At least not today. Very common on the C4. Sometimes the blower motor gets burned out. Sometimes it gets filled with, you know, dead mice bodies and debris and dust and just plants, crap, all kinds of stuff that mice cram in there. But it's a very big job to do on the C4, as is the blend door. In most cases, if you're going to do anything majorly HVAC related, the entire dashboard has to come out. It's a big job. So definitely keep that in mind. Over the life of the car, if HVAC is something that you use regularly, that can be a common problem. Number one, weather stripping. As you can see, the weather stripping on this car, well, it sucks. This is very common. Many C4s have this problem. There is many companies that make kits to replace the weather stripping, which is fantastic. I love having parts available. However, the vast majority of these parts suck. And all these weather stripping replacement, the cheap ones, generally garbage. They don't fit. People have had problems closing the doors. People have had problems with the windows not closing. Very lame. There is a company out of Michigan. Everybody loves supporting Michigan companies, especially me, that makes a very, very nice weather stripping kit for the C4 Corvette. All the weather stripping for the whole car. You can buy it individually or in a kit. The company is called Corvette Rubber. Not very creative in the name, but gets the job done. From what I understand, they're very, very high quality, and they're a local company, which is cool. When I do my weather stripping replacement, that's who I will be using. Another thing to keep in mind is the pop-up headlights. I've mentioned this in my other common problems videos. Very common problem on all GM cars with pop-up headlights. However, it's not that hard to fix. So don't let people take advantage of you and charge you an arm and a leg to repair this, because all these motors are extremely similar. What fails is generally not the motor, but rather the gear inside of it. There's a nylon gear, and over time, with heat cycles and age, the nylon gear's teeth break off and cause the motor to spin uncontrollably, which makes terrible noises. But yeah, you can just replace the gear most of the time and get away with not replacing the whole motor. And on the C4, it's very easy to get to. So yeah, pop-up headlights can be problematic, but they are not that hard to fix. Another common C4 failure point is the battery. It is kind of tricky to remove compared to a normal car. Generally, it is advised to just remove this panel and slide the battery out that way. However, many of these C4s came with kind of iffy batteries when they were new, and many of them were prone to leaking. And Unfortunately, you know, the car's all made of plastic except for the frame. And guess what happens when the battery leaks acid onto the frame, which is right underneath it? It rusts. So while the Corvette is generally not a rust-prone vehicle, the chassis underneath the battery can be rust-prone, and it's definitely something to look at when you're getting a C4. Just look under the car, make sure the pinch weld and that frame rail is nice and solid and not rusted out. Because if the battery's been leaking on it for the last 40 years, it can definitely have some significant rust. Another common issue, much like the C5, is many owners have reported issues replacing the windshield. You wouldn't think it's that complex and that much different than a regular windshield, and I think if you really have a skilled windshield installer, I don't think it is that difficult. But many Safelite facilities and businesses that are similar will not touch C4s and C5s and C6s for that matter. So if you've got a cracked windshield on a car that you're trying to buy, definitely do your research and make sure you have a way to replace that windshield, because it can be tricky to find somebody that's willing to do that for you. And it can be tricky to find the glass itself, because these cars are not that common relative to the everyday car. So if you have a broken windshield, it can be an expensive endeavor to replace. Another common problem is this here power antenna. They get stuck. The motors die. They'll start grinding and making terrible sounds. They'll get stuck halfway up. They'll get stuck all the way up. All kinds of problems with the power antenna. It's not that big of a deal. Most of us, including myself, don't really use FM radio that much anymore. I do have a little Bluetooth adapter that runs on an FM signal, but even if the antenna is stuck down, it still receives it just fine. But yeah, power antennas, and it's not just on the C4. This is like this on many other cars of this era. Power antennas, very unreliable, and they break all the time. Another common problem, and I'll show you here, is improper lifting of the car, which can lead to a whole lot of body damage if you're not careful. Now the C4 has a pinch weld that runs along the car from front to back. There's one right here that starts, you see there, mine's in pretty good shape, and it runs along the side of the car, and you go here. Now if you see, we have this thing that says jacking location. Gives you two handy arrows, and you have one that says jacking location right there. Very convenient. Do not put a jack directly on that pinch weld. You will bend it, you will smash it, you will screw up the rocker panel plastic, you will destroy your car if you put a basic jack right on that pinch weld. What you want to do is get an adapter puck. It's shaped like this, it goes over the pinch weld, and it has a nice flat surface. On countless other cars, when I'm lifting the car from the pinch welds, makes your life so much easier and will preserve your car for decades to come. C4s have had many problems with people lifting them improperly and actually blowing holes through the floor pans. It's a very, very common thing because people lift the car will slip slightly on the jack, and the jack will go through the floor pan, because on this car, the floor pans are actually fiberglass. They are not metal. So if you put any kind of upward force on them, they will shatter and you will be in for a rough time. So make sure you lift your car properly, and make sure that when you buy a C4, it has been lifted properly in the past. This car, thankfully, does not seem to have any significant damage from improper lifting. But remember, go off those jacking points that are labeled on the bottom of the car and use those puck adapters so you protect the pinch welds and everything around them. Alright fellas, so that concludes the common problems list for the C4. Again, this is not all of the problems that the C4 will have, and maybe your C4 will have none of these problems, in which case, good for you, and I hope your luck continues. But these are very common problems that affect many C4s, so knowledge is power, and I hope you leave this video a like, comment if I forgot anything, and I hope you now know your C4 a little bit better than you did before. Thanks guys, thanks for watching.